Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I want to talk a bit about the wonderful reference book on the iconic classic character of Doc Savage, which is A History of the Doc Savage Adventures by Robert Carter, which was brought out by McFarland in 2009 in this lovely paperback that has the original artwork from the very first Doc Savage novel, The Man of Bronze, which I have here in the beautiful Sanctum reprint. This is essentially the one volume you need in order to have a great background on Doc Savage, but also a good summary and listing of all of the various adventures, because this not only goes over all of the pulp novels, but also the other appearances of the character throughout comics especially, and also the film adaptation that George Pal made in the 1970s, which has a particular reputation because to say it's a misfire is an understatement, but it certainly has its fans and it is trying hard, but it is really great to have further discussion on that film. But also it has discussion on other appearances of the character, including the DC Comics attempt to relaunch the character and their radical revisions they made. But basically, it's any adaptation of Doc Savage or appearance of Doc Savage, including fanzines, all the way up until when the book was published in 2009. So in that sense, it's really the companion volume to The Shadow in Review, which does the same for The Shadow, except this is a mammoth tome that gives you a gigantic multi-page review of all of the 300 plus Shadow novels. But of course, because The Shadow had more novels than Doc, that means this book is obviously going to be longer. But basically, if you have The Shadow in Review, this Doc Savage volume is basically the rough equivalent, though it is much shorter because it's not John Olson's mammoth tome, which I have reviewed on this channel. But if you don't have a copy of this, you need it because look how thick this thing is. But if you were wanting a similar volume for Doc Savage, this book from McFarland is basically what you're looking for. So this is in a nice softcover oversized volume. It has a nice laminated feel to the cover. Of course, this is reproducing the iconic artwork from Doc Savage #1, where Doc has his iconic ripped shirt, as he always does. And of course, this is where he's going after the treasure that his father has left him that will fund all of his adventures. Now, this volume does look slim, but that's actually quite deceptive. So don't be fooled that you're not going to get your money's worth. And of course, it's a book from McFarland, so you know it's going to be beautifully laid out and informative and very much worth its purchase price. But this is basically a Doc Savage book in their traditional sort of layout. So we have some critical pieces and then diving into the actual detailing of the character. So the introduction is basically an overview of the character and the character's creation and the house name of Kenneth Robeson that was used by Street and Smith on all the books. But of course, the real primary force was Lester Dent, who wrote most of the Doc Savage novels and was the person who really gave Doc Savage and the Fabulous Five all of their magic and brought these characters in this fantastic world to life. But this also goes over the character's extraordinary influence, which is, shall we say, beyond massive, which I have covered in my review of the first novel. But the biggest thing is that without Doc Savage, there would be no Superman. But without Doc Savage, there would not be a comics industry. Doc is pretty much second only to The Shadow in terms of overall influence, in terms of not just the realm of pulp heroes, but since comic books really arose out of pulp magazines and took everything that wasn't nailed down by basically borrowing stories, characters, concepts wholesale, and had copyrights been enforced strongly back in the day, it is unlikely we would have even seen the comic book heroes emerge that we now know and sort of take for granted. But basically, you read a Doc Savage novel, and so much of not just comics and hero storytelling, but so much of the fictional landscape and really pop culture will suddenly jump out at you, and you just say to yourself, what has not ripped these off? What has this not influenced? Because the stories could range between very action-oriented, they could be straight-out mysteries, or they could go completely into the science fiction realm, which Doc would do frequently, seeing as he was an expert at virtually everything. But we have a nicely written, it is only 10 pages, but it's a nicely written introduction that goes over everything. But again, because it's a oversized McFarland book, 10 pages is actually quite a lot. And we do have nice images throughout, but of course they're in black and white. The majority of the book is actually dedicated to what is credited as chapter 1, but this is basically a short summary of all of the pulp novels. And what makes this the largest portion of the book is, of course, it's all the pulp novels. So you get a nice summary to refer to, along with some images thrown in here and there. So that way, I think this is a great resource to have as you're going through the series. Because this is a synopsis for each book, it's probably not best to read this all the way through before you've read every Doc novel, because you will most likely spoil the ones you haven't read. So like the Shadow and Review, I like having this on the shelf to then pull out after I've finished a Doc novel. So I think this is really great to have as a reference, or to see some of the books you haven't gotten to yet, but it doesn't really go into full spoiler territory, but you kind of want to go in completely cold with a novel such as a Doc Savage work. But again, we do get nice images mixed in throughout of both the original Pulp magazine covers and the iconic James Bama covers for the Bantam paperbacks in the 1960s, which is really what relaunched the character and made him popular for a whole new generation. This goes until chapter 2, which picks up the summaries of the novels by talking about the World War II years specifically, and how that affected not only the Doc Savage character and the magazines, but also the publishing side of pulp magazines in terms of printing style and having to have reduced costs and having to deal with wartime rationing and shortages, but also the desires of the public changed. But that is something you have to look at with all the pulp characters who were still around during World War II. Then section 3 is about the post-war years going into the atomic age of the 1950s. And then the last section is part 3 about the post-war years and then going up to just before the start of the 1950s and getting into the atomic age, because unfortunately the Doc Savage series ended in 1949. Chapter 4 is the comic history of Doc Savage. So this starts, of course, with the Street and Smith comics and their attempts to make their characters successful in the comic realm really varied wildly. They never caught on like the comic superheroes and vigilantes that were basically directly copied from or at sometimes were actually clones of the Street Smith characters. But they tried different things with Doc Savage, and sometimes they altered the character dramatically, and it's really great to have full details of that. But then also how various other publishers tried to bring Doc Savage back, even including the iconic Gold Key comics tried a Doc Savage, but it wasn't really until the paperback reprints in the 1960s for the actual novels that Doc became successful. But of course, there were the fascinating Marvel comics in the 70s, the best of them being the Black and White series that has been collected a few times. And those are probably the best Doc Savage comics there are. And then this goes into, of course, the 1980s DC Comics attempt to relaunch the character. That was basically a brand new Doc Savage from scratch that really didn't go well with the actual original Pulp incarnation. And then, of course, there were the 90s comics from Millennium, along with Dark Horse trying Doc Savage and doing some Shadow crossovers, which were great. Chapter 5 deals with the Doc Savage film, but then also the various radio versions of the character, and basically any other medium besides the original pulp novels and comics. Chapter 6 deals entirely with the various fanzines, and I really find these fascinating because this is, of course, long before the internet existed, and this was all basically fans trying to keep their fandom alive by making their own fanzines and doing it entirely as a labor of love, and hoping there was somebody out there who wanted the Xeroxed handmade fan magazine sent in the mail. And then we close with a final section talking about the legacy of the character and some of the other works, particularly the continuation books by Will Murray and others. but this being in 2009, or being written just before that, really, it's not covering the handful of appearances of Doc Savage that have happened since this book came out. And there have been a few other comic appearances and some more modern Will Murray novels, for example, but this is still the best overall single volume about the history and the development of the character, but the bulk of it is actually doing a synopsis of the entire run of the original Pulp novels. So those are my thoughts on the volume A History of the Doc Savage Adventures, which again is, I think, the companion to The Shadow in Review, as it is the perfect reference book to have on the shelf if you're a Doc Savage fan and you're reading through the Pulp novels for the first time. It's a very engaging and extremely information-packed read, but of course, it being a McFarland book means that the price tag's usually a little bit higher, but it is very much worth it. Although I would say that if you're like me and you're just reading the novels for the first time, it's probably best to have it on the shelf as a reference. And so I've been reading some of the synopsis pieces of the various novels and the comics that I have read, but then for the others, I'm sort of saving it until I actually get to read that particular novel, and then I'll be able to pull this off the shelf and flip through that particular section I'm looking for after I've finished the new to me novel. So as always, I hope my babblings about Doc Savage and the world of Pulp adventures has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, this is really the best reference book there is about the Man of Bronze, and so it is essential to have if you're a Doc Savage fan. This is basically the one reference book you can have on the shelf, and it basically does a good job at covering most everything up to when it was written in 2009. So please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores and the work of publishers putting out great works from authors like this that are delving into the history of truly important characters and aspects of media that don't get the love and attention that they deserve, particularly for a character like Doc Savage, who is one of the most influential characters in all of fiction. A great portion of not just American pop culture, but pop culture at large, and storytelling of the 20th century simply wouldn't exist without Doc Savage. And this is the one true reference book to have about the incredible world of Doc. And even if you've never read a Doc Savage novel, you can just leaf through this book and get a sense of how important this character is and why these stories are so timeless. So keep reading print books, keep reading magical pulp fiction, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.